All right, thanks everyone for joining. I think there's probably still a few people joining us, but we'll make a start. So thank you very much for joining us for this month's ADIA meetup, which is about the myGov recent review and its links to digital inclusion and what we can learn from the review. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that each of us are joining from this afternoon. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And encourage you as well to put into the chat window in Zoom where you're joining us from today. And probably also acknowledge in the context of today's discussion, people living in Australia's 1,100 remote First Nations communities are some of the most digitally excluded. And we know that these are some of the communities that also have some of the biggest challenges in accessing myGov. So we should really keep that in mind as we're having the discussion today. But thank you again for joining us. My name is David Spriggs. I'm the CEO of Infoxchange and the chair of the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance. I'll be your moderator this afternoon. I'm really pleased that you could join us, and we've got some fantastic panelists joining us today that you can see on the screen. So today we'll be hearing from Amit Singh, who was a member of the Australian Government's expert review panel into myGov. Dr. Kim Osman, who probably be well known to many on this call, who's a senior research associate at Queensland University of Technology and has been involved in the digital inclusion space for a long time. And then really pleased to have Rebecca Atkinson join us from the York Community Resource Centre. So we'll let each of them speak to their work shortly, but just by way of a quick introduction to each of our speakers, Amit has a broad range of experience in strategy development, policy and regulatory affairs, and he served as a senior advisor to 2 Australian prime ministers. He then relocated to San Francisco to take up a position with Uber as head of economic policy. And then in October last year, Amit was appointed to the 5-person panel led by David Thodey that was reviewing myGov, along with Julian Mangrant, Ed Santo, and Professor Emily Banks. So welcome to Amit.
Hi.
And we have Kim Osman, a senior research associate with the Digital Media Research Centre at QUT, and looks at that complex relationship between digital and social inclusion, focusing on the role of social infrastructure in informal education in improving digital literacy. And Kim at the moment's been leading a massive piece of work, a kind of cross-sector collaboration, looking at how low-income families access and use technology for education as part of their everyday lives. Kim's also recently completed an evaluation of the State Library of Queensland's digital inclusion program. So thanks for being with us, Kim. And finally, we welcome Rebecca from the York Community Resource Centre in Western Australia. I had to look up where York was. It's about 100 kilometres east of Perth, Rebecca tells me. Not too far to drive into Perth, but a beautiful regional community. And the Community Resource Centre is a non-profit community-based organisation for the community by the community, with a mission to empower individuals and groups within the community by providing opportunities for education, training and development of life skills, self-help and mutual support. And the York CRC is a delivery partner of BeConnected, one of our flagship digital inclusion programs, which is run by the Good Things Foundation. So really appreciate you joining us today, Rebecca. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This session's being recorded and will be available after the event by the next edition of the ADIA newsletter. If you are not currently a subscriber, please subscribe to the newsletter. Caitlin will probably drop the link into the chat on Zoom. So we'll start today by hearing from each of our panelists, and then we'll move into a Q&A. But as we've done on many of these meetups, we'd really encourage you to put in questions as we go and make use of the chat feature as well. Really keen if you can do that, and we might, at the end of each speaker, we might have a time for a quick question. Otherwise, we'll certainly come back to some of your questions at the end. But we would love for you just to put your questions in as we go through the session. And if you're using the chat, just a note, we're hopefully all used to Zoom by now, but if you're sending a message, please make sure it says to panelists and attendees, and that way everybody can see your message in the chat. So before we get into today's session, quickly about the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance. We were established following the National Year of Digital Inclusion in 2016, and has grown now to be a shared initiative with over 500 business, government, academic and community organisations, all looking at how can we accelerate action on digital inclusion. The Alliance is supported by Infoxchange, it's backed by Google and Telstra, and Australia Post was a founding partner of the Alliance. And our vision really is to build a digitally inclusive Australia. And really for us, what does that mean? It's really about giving people the opportunity to fully participate in economy and society. So I think we've moved well beyond the days of digital inclusion just being access to a device. That's still highly important, but now it's very much around access, it's around ability, it's around affordability, and I'm sure this will come out in the discussion today as well, access for people with a disability. We're driven in a lot of our work by the Australian Digital Inclusion Index. That's well known to most of you on this call, but still showing us that over a quarter of the population in Australia is either highly digitally excluded or digitally excluded. And that group represents many of whom who are on low incomes, who haven't completed a secondary education, who may not currently be in the workforce, people with a disability, First Nations communities. And I think probably a strong overlap for our discussion today on some of the biggest users of myGov, or people who have the most need for support from government services. But quickly to introduce today's topic on myGov. So Services Australia describes myGov as a simple and secure way to access services in one place. Wouldn't we all love if that was the true statement, and that was everybody in the community's experience of using myGov. But it is a really substantial piece of infrastructure and allows people to connect in with Medicare, Centrelink, child support, and a whole range of government services. The user audit was announced by Minister Shorten last year, and the expert panel, which included Amit, looked at how myGov was performing for Australians. Some really interesting stats to come out of that for me. Things like there's 25 million active myGov accounts. That's more than doubled in the last 5 years. And there's 1.4 million users of myGov each and every day. Which, to put this into perspective, this was in the findings, that's apparently more people than catch public transport in Australia on a day-to-day basis. It's just incredible. So this is clearly a piece of national infrastructure now. And I think the review was extremely timely on providing recommendations to government on, where is myGov performing well, where are needs for improvement, and some areas of recommendation. And our goal today, I guess, is to understand the review in a bit more detail, but really understand then the intersection with digital inclusion. But enough from me in terms of an introduction. So I'm going to pass to Amit now, who, as I say, we're really fortunate for Amit to join us. He was on the expert review panel, and he's going to give us an overview of some of this review's findings. So over to you, Amit. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, David. And thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to speak with you about this topic and about government digital services. I should note that I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I'm on, which is the same as David, but I acknowledge that particularly on this day of all days, given the news we've heard earlier today. I was privileged to be part of this group that was looking at myGov, because the technical term for, I think, our panel was the myGov User Audit Expert Panel. But really, I think the way we approached our work was to consider how government digital services operated, particularly federal government digital services operated in relation to citizens and in relation to Australians. And I think we took that sort of responsibility in that dual fashion seriously, because I think that this was a much larger question about how we think about the structure of that. myGov itself is actually quite as David mentioned, is a critical piece of infrastructure, but it's also quite narrow in terms of the way in which its scope is within the bureaucratic structure of government. And that, in essence, actually, illustrates the challenges that we face in terms of thinking about government digital services and its and the way in which it sort of responds to citizens and ensures that it provides them with the key and important services in a way that is tailored to them and that matches their vulnerability. One of the things I think that is really important to say at the outset is the work of the user audit expert panel is complete, but the government's response is still being considered by the government. We have provided our recommendations to the government, and it is now up to the ministers and the government to respond accordingly. So I'll speak to the report, but I should just say at the beginning that this is not Australian government policy. We expect that their findings, their responses, or their responses to our recommendations should be positive. But I don't speak for the Australian government in a sense. So what was the scope of our work? What we were really trying to look at is the user experience, functions, and performance of myGov, and what we wanted to look at that in terms of the present view of what myGov was, but also in connection to how we think about the future direction of government services in general. And I think one of the things that's really clear, and one of the things that became obvious during the pandemic, was there was a huge amount of growth of the use of myGov, in essence, because of the nature of how people, how we had to sort of operate our daily lives. And we were very conscious of that because government digital services are different to typical digital services. There isn't really much choice, and so yes, a lot of people signed up for myGov, but there wasn't a reflection of the fact of a better experience. It was because they had to, right? And so what was the experience of users in that period? And one of the interesting parts about our work is that everybody that usually when you do a review or you do some kind of policy work, there's usually a population that you're doing it with that you're not part of, right? But we were all users of myGov. We all got those annoying messages saying, you have mail, which is like, that's great, but like, what's it about? And so what was really interesting was also reflecting our own experiences through that and reflecting the experiences of our friends and colleagues. And while it is used by a lot of people, there's also a lot of frustrations about how it might be used. And one thing that was really clear in the way in which we approached our work was to kind of be really mindful of that and to look at the kind of widest possible spectrum of opinions on those, but also then to kind of reflect that in the context of a positive view about how to address some of those particular challenges. And we took an approach that was really focused on picking out as much as we could of the broader cross-section of the community. We ran a range of different surveys. We used existing user data, which is quite extensive and ongoing. We took public submissions. We also ran focus groups in particular for vulnerable communities. So we ran focus groups where it was actually hard to collect data, and including in Indigenous communities, because we really wanted to kind of understand the nature of how this, how myGov had been operating. We also held a lot of conversations with government officials, and one thing that will surprise everybody is that myGov, while it is the front end of the actual government digital experience, it's not actually operated by the rest of the system. So what we found was that as David mentioned before, the use of myGov has grown in the last few years. The number of people that use it on a daily basis, more people use it than use public transport. More people use it than access the hospital system every day. That gives you kind of a sense of the nature of it as critical infrastructure. But it's also kind of important to sort of think about it in the context of how people are using it. With the growth of mobile devices, more people are using it on a mobile basis, and more people are also using it in a way in which it's linking up other types of government services. And that's probably one of the kind of big challenges that we identified, was that because there hadn't been a kind of coordinated strategy up to this point, because we had been thinking about myGov as a program and funding it for a number of years, we didn't sort of see it as a kind of integrated offering. We didn't see it as a platform, or, as David mentioned, as a piece of infrastructure. So I think one of those things, so that was a kind of really important finding for us in the context of how we thought about the challenges. So the first really big finding was that myGov is national digital infrastructure. People use it and rely on it in a particular way, and we have to treat it it in that particular way. So we don't treat it as a program or an app or a service. We treat it as an ongoing kind of platform for that, which means we make choices about how to design and structure it in a way that is relevant for individuals. We also need to think about it in the context of the digital channel of delivery of government services is no longer the fringe kind of channel. It is the central challenge. It is a central channel. But one thing that we were really focused on as a panel, and we kept coming back to this, was that if the digital channel is the principal channel, what are the other channels that allow people to get access? How do you think about multi-channeling in a way that is a reflection of, individual users' vulnerability or capacity to access, or their sort of lack of ability to kind of use the digital channel? And I think what that does is if you get better, if your digital channel gets better, then you can actually dedicate more resources to those other channels. And what our hope was that by improving the digital channel, you would provide better bases for phone contact. You'd provide better bases for the way in which you would think about contact within services, or even where services could go to communities and actually provide the services in communities. And part of the ways in which you improve that is through seamless handoff. So when you're trying to do something online and it doesn't work, and it calls through, and you don't have to go through the whole process again. You've kind of, the person on the phone can pick it up. So that was one of the kind of things that we said would be a good thing to kind of think about in the future, and something that we know, the relevant services are thinking about right now. But in terms of our findings, we basically had principally 10 findings. I'll focus on the 10th one the most, but let me just run you through the 9 before. So one was that it was critical infrastructure. Related to that was that we needed to make sure that we thought about it. If you thought about it as infrastructure, you invested in it in the same way that you think about infrastructure. So you don't, so you're thinking about, a roadmap for the future. You're thinking about the services that you're going to add in. You're thinking about the capacity of the system. One thing that we heard over and over again in our consultations was that Australians still have a lot of difficulty in getting what they need and getting things done with myGov. So one of the kind of challenges was, how do you improve that sort of front door? If it is the front door indeed to government services, how do you improve that kind of navigation? How do you improve, because and I'll run you through the complications of why that navigation is harder, but the upshot is, I think what we found from our research was that everybody wanted that to be improved. I think one of the things that was really important for us was that there was the equity angle. And this is, I think, a really important distinction that we need to make when we think about government digital services versus digital services in general. Government digital services have to account for the entire population, right? And so whereas in a technology setting, or in a tech company, or anywhere, anyone that sort of worked in a kind of commercial or private sector organization, you talk about the kind of edge cases and how you might solve for the edge cases. In public policy, the edge case is the main case, right? Like in public policy, that's the thing you're trying to sort of solve for. And so one of the things that we thought was really important is that government digital services needed to adopt a different mentality to these types of issues. The challenges were more important. The focus on ensuring that vulnerability was right was more acute. That also related to usability. What we found was that there were many practical issues in managing accounts. There was potential barriers for the number of Australians that could use it. The way in which you thought about accessing the accounts was incredibly frustrating. We also thought that what that also led to was effectively that frustrating experience was then compounded by the way in which the services worked. How could it be smarter? How could you have tell it once in a way that actually operated like tell it once was supposed to operate, which is that you provide a piece of information, it filters through the different services, or that the services are able to push up different things based on your particular circumstances. One of the things that also came up was that there's a challenge in thinking about the adoption of digital identity, and how the way in which we think about digital identity has become more acute. Part of that is a challenge because of because of what we saw at the back end of last year in terms of the provision of information to different different commercial providers or to other people around digital ID. But part of it is also because actually typical IDs are not available as easily as possible. UNICEF estimates that there's about 200,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians that don't have a birth certificate. And so actually, in fact, getting a form of kind of digital ID is actually, in a sense, trying to sort of solve for some of those particular challenges. I think support is also really important, because if you think about the nature of the quality of the digital platform, it needs to be matched by world-class support for those particular services. And so it's not just looking at one particular channel at once. And then I think the last thing was that the nature of getting government digital services right is actually not just an exercise in delivering for citizens. It's actually about building an important piece of national infrastructure. Now, some of the challenges that came up, is that a lot of those particular issues are systemic. A lot of those particular issues are a function of three main factors. One is that the structures of government don't really encourage agencies to line up services. Our Westminster system of government allocates responsibility to ministers, who then are responsible to parliaments. It doesn't allocate responsibility to ministers to be nice to each other and work with each other. And as a result, we have these sort of structures that don't really work in terms of providing services between things. That's why you get a message that says you got mail, because myGov is operated by Services Australia, and typically the mail is from the tax office, and so the two two agencies can't work as well together. We also still think about this as funding an IT project. How do we kind of invest in buying a piece of kit, when actually instead, if we thought about it as national infrastructure, we would make different choices. And the third thing is, one thing that is typically, again, a characteristic of the way in which you think about digital services, but not government digital services, is when you think in a context of like standard digital services, you think you can fix it by having a series of different tech improvements or fix of a series of different kind of user experiences. But actually, when you're dealing with government digital services, it's actually fixing things beyond myGov itself. It's how do you think about the access to government for face-to-face services, for digital services, for telephony, but also how do you deal with the nature of the fact that everybody in the population has different, finds themselves in different places at different points in time, and how do you account for those particular challenges? And I think that's really, really important. We made a series of different recommendations. I won't go through all of them, but I'll give you the kind of gist of the 4 buckets of those recommendations. The first was we needed to improve the user experience. I think that's very obvious to any of the 25 million people that have used myGov, right? But I think one of the things that was really important was we needed to do it on a principle basis. And that principle was that no one is left behind and that we uphold Australian human rights. I was fortunate in this panel to be joined by 4 other eminent people, David Thodey, who's the former CEO of Telstra, Ed Santa, who's Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, Julia Inman-Grant, who is Australia's e-safety commissioner and probably the leading e-safety commissioner of any around the world, and Professor Emily Banks, who's probably one of Australia's leading epidemiologists, social epidemiologists. And so this was a particular thing that was really important to all of us, was that when we think about myGov, when we think about it as critical national infrastructure, the baseline has to be that there is a way in which we have thought about no one being left behind. So user experience was one thing. The second thing was making sure that we thought of this as an enduring commitment. We don't fund national infrastructure because with a cliff. We fund it because we think it's going to. We don't build roads because we think that the roads are going to end in 2023 in 2033, and at that point the road will just dissolve into the kind of ether. We build them because we think that this thing is going to be something that persists, and that's what we think should happen with myGov. It also means that we need to tend to that as time passes. Identity was kind of another question, and digital identity is a very vexed topic, and we could probably spend an entire session talking about digital identity. But I think one of the kind of challenges on it is that we've spent a lot of time working out ways in which we might try to solve for those. But what we haven't done is we haven't focused on the other part of the digital identity debate, which is how do we give people and citizens the protection and assurance that digital ID is going to be used for the purpose that it states. And once we do that, how do we do that in a way in which it actually protects them from all of the multiple variations of digital ID that may emerge? What our research showed very clearly was that Australians wanted one or two forms of digital ID. They didn't want the multiplication that we are sort of seeing today. So how do we kind of deliver for citizens, but do it in a way that builds a trustworthy system? And then the fourth bucket of kind of recommendations were really about governance, partnership, and design. Now, there is a truism that sort of states that, whenever you're delivering a technology solution, the reason it fails isn't because the technology was insufficient. It wasn't because nobody could architect it, or there wasn't a kind of particular design or an engineering feature that could allow you to do it. It's quite often a problem because the policy wasn't right, the governance wasn't right, you didn't set the expectations well, you didn't have the right capability to deliver it. You didn't bring people along the journey. And I think that's one thing that's very easy to get trapped up when you think about government digital services. You blame the technology. Now, in some cases, the technology is bad, so the technology is deployed in a way that is not particularly useful, but quite often it's actually because of a design feature. And so what we wanted to do was focus on getting that right, focus on how we make citizens at the center of that question. How do we work out a way in which we get governments to work together? How do we work, how do we do it in a way in which we're designing it that is consistent in the way in which we think about those design patterns? Where there isn't this multifarious experience from different departments and different things, where people are able to perceive those things. And how do we support people to get those particular experiences? I might pause there. But I think one of the things that's really important for us is to think about the vision of myGov as being something that is easy to use, where it actually is responsive and fits with your life events. How do we kind of give you this sense that at different points as you go along, it's kind of actually helping you out? Something that's intuitive and integrated. All of those things I think are really, really important to the way in which we approached our work and the way in which we wanted to consider the nature of the types of things that we were focused on. I'm happy to answer any questions or talk any further about that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a really rich set of insights into the review, and really pleasing us to hear that time that you spent to kind of understand the needs of vulnerable communities and looking at that kind of rights-based approach as you talked about. And I think we all know from a community perspective some of those challenges in digital ID and physical ID, and helping people get to that digital ID as well. So I'm sure some of those themes will come up. Just encourage everybody to please use the chat function, and please put in questions as we go. So we'll have some time to follow up with questions with Amit after we've heard from each of our panelists. But thank you so much, Amit. And we'll keep moving. And so really looking forward to hearing from Kim from QUT on some of your perspectives, Kim, and observations from the research you've been undertaking and how that links into myGov and digital inclusion. So over to you. Thanks, Kim.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded lands of the Quandamooka people today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So as David mentioned, I'm going to be talking to probably two key pieces of research that we've been doing in the Digital Inclusion and Participation program at QUT. One of those is our linkage on advancing digital inclusion in low-income families, and the other is the evaluation of digital inclusion programs that are run by the State Library of Queensland, so just within Queensland. And just as a caveat to that, I think we're sort of talking about these communities, the low-income families and the libraries. There was a lot of complexity among these families. So even though I'm pulling out some common themes today, everybody's experience of using myGov and of being a low-income family is quite different and quite complex. So over the last couple of years, we've been talking to families and community organisations in 7 communities around Australia. And we've also spoken with library staff and staff in Indigenous knowledge centres around Queensland as well. As you can imagine, they've all got quite a bit to say about myGov, so I'll just talk to some of that today. I guess our first finding is that our families, a lot of our families are mobile only. So as Amit was saying, people are accessing myGov on mobile phones. This absolutely reflects what we've found with our families. So they're managing, these large intergenerational families on mobile phones. But within that, there's, a range of how people are actually engaging with myGov. So some of our families are openly sharing passwords. They've got help actually using myGov, whereas some people are really hesitant to share information. They're, quite aware of, their own skills shortages and skills gaps, and so might be a little bit hesitant to engage online. So, in these cases, they're finding people that can actually help them do that. One of the things I will say is that I was really glad to hear that you're referring to myGov as critical digital infrastructure, and not as an IT project, because I think all of our research, is really around all those really complex, socio-cultural factors that go into how people access this system. So I think approaching it as an infrastructure project is absolutely the right path. Another one of our first kind of key findings in relation to service use is that a lot of our families, are interacting with quite a lot of services. So it's not just myGov services that they're accessing through the portal. People are accessing housing providers, might be the Smith family, who's one of our linkage providers, school services, young carers, NDIS providers. So when people are accessing, this variety of services, they're actually having what we're calling service exhaustion. So they're getting through these front doors, but they're having to navigate a whole variety of different portals. And what we have found is that that's often down to one family member. So, it might be, in one example that I can give you, it might be mum who is navigating online portals because she's trying to get support and diagnosis for her children who have healthcare and learning needs. She herself has healthcare needs. She's helping her elderly parents, her dad with his small business, navigate the ATO, and she's really struggling, and she's just exhausted because it takes a lot of time getting all the appointments. And as she said, and this is not news to anybody here, she normally ends up on the phone because she can't do what she needs to do via the online portal. So she's still kind of making that phone call and through to the service provider to speak with them on the phone. Another issue that comes up in our families is the level of not just digital literacies, but foundational literacies. So some of our families are really struggling with those foundational literacies. So actually navigating the portals and the information that's on online services like myGov is quite difficult for them. And so they do need support in that area. One of the other things that we found is that it's not just that ability level. There's also technical barriers that exist for our families when they're trying to access myGov. As I said, they're on mobile devices, but they're not always on the same mobile device. And we know this when we try and, get an interview with them or ring them up to try and meet them. It's not always the same number. So this idea of kind of having one account that's linked to one number just doesn't really work in the real world, because devices are getting handed among family members, SIMs are getting swapped out, quite often they're on really expensive prepaid mobile data and it's running out. So they're having to make decisions about what happens with that data. And, a lot of the time that's getting shared among children for schoolwork and homework and things like that. So these are really key decisions that people are making. And more recently, obviously, with the cost of living crisis as well, actually purchasing the data is another decision, because, where else could that money be going in terms of groceries and other bills as well? So we think, part of the issues with myGov is the data that it costs. The app is great. I've used the app. I really like it. But our families can be quite hesitant to download apps, especially if they're not sure how much data it's going to be to download that app, and also if they're not sure of how much data that app actually uses. So if you're storing documents in there or things are getting kind of uploaded and downloaded to the cloud, how much data is that actually going to cost them? So they might be a little bit hesitant to engage with the app. So this idea of data and technical barriers, this is where social infrastructure comes in. So things like free community Wi-Fi and libraries are really key to helping our families access government services. If you need appropriate devices, sometimes it's not as easy on a mobile phone. Sometimes you do need a computer or a laptop. Sometimes you might need to scan documents and submit those. So they need help from other agencies. So it might be a neighbourhood centre or a library to go and do that. We found that people are using libraries to do this. One of the reasons is that libraries are safe and welcoming spaces, and Centrelink's just not quite there yet. So we know that Centrelink has a remit to do this, that they have staff that will help you go through and access myGov, but people aren't using it because the library is just a much nicer place for them to be. They feel comfortable and they feel supported. Library staff are wonderful, welcoming people, you know, that really want to help the people that come through their front door. So they're doing that with their clients that come through the front door. We did hear reports of Centrelink agents in some of the communities that we visited, but universally across both our low-income families research and our libraries research, the phrase was, it's just a computer and a phone. So there's no one there actually to help you. It's just a computer and a phone. So no one's actually making use of the Centrelink agents that are there. You know, and this is especially true in rural and remote locations as well. So one of the things that it's raised is, especially in the libraries research, is what happens when library staff are gifted very personal information. They're also, you know, photocopying and storing data from people that is quite personal data. And look, this is a really ongoing conversation. Some of our library staff like to use it as a learning opportunity. So people will come in, they'll scan things. The library staff member will show them, you know, this is what I'm doing, this is where I'm storing it. And actually now that we've sent it off to the agency or the service provider, or it's, you know, been uploaded to Centrelink or whatever government service, they can then, you know, show them that it's been deleted and they don't have a record of it anymore. But a lot of the time people are just coming in for a task-based approach to accessing myGov or government services. So they're not coming in to learn about myGov per se, like they might be elsewhere. They're actually just coming in to, you know, to do one thing. And what we have concluded from this is that this very individualistic approach to government service provision doesn't work. And I like to see that reflected in the audit findings as well. You know, this idea of a nominee or having somebody who can help somebody, you know, actually do what they need to get done via myGov would be wonderful and would help our families, and I know would help library staff as well. Having some kind of framework around that nominee so that it's safe and it's secure and people know that that's what can happen. I think that would be really helpful to a lot of our families. And again, this idea of, you know, when you are working with somebody and you are telling them that information, that you don't have to retell anything, that it goes from system to system. And if you do have to make the phone call, that your information is still there as well. So that's another thing that we'd like to see. And Amit talked about this a little bit, and that's an idea of having seamless service navigation beyond the myGov front door. When we were speaking to people, there wasn't, you know, a huge recognition of what they're using myGov for, but people would refer to using it for, you know, accessing Centrelink or the ATO or AbStudy, things like this. So actually being able to go through and, you know, alleviate some of that exhaustion would be wonderful as well. And just lastly, to the point that Amit raised around digital identity, I think this is a really interesting discussion, and we'd be really looking forward to see how that would play out, especially for some of the families in rural and remote locations. You know, we've had reports of people having to drive 100 kilometres to a Centrelink agency with their ID documents only to find out that they've forgotten something when they've got there. So that's a 200-kilometre round trip for nothing, which when you're a low-income family and the cost of living and petrol is, you know, it's really, really hard. So actually being able to have staff in small towns, nominees that can help people with these tasks to alleviate some of those other factors would be really wonderful and welcome for our families. So really, really like the finding that, you know, myGov can be improved to help the people that need it most, the most vulnerable. We look forward to chatting a bit more about that. Thanks, David.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kim, and a fairly fantastic range of insights there on some of those real world challenges. A lot of good discussion in the chat going on around the role of libraries as well. And as you said, Kim, that sort of safe and welcoming environment and that kind of critical community infrastructure role that libraries play. Also some good discussion in the chat, though, of just the expectation that libraries are able to respond to all of this demand when they're not necessarily resourced, they're not resourced to perform the role to the extent that they often do. So please keep the chat coming. There's been some good questions we'll pick up in the chat as well, and please keep putting those questions into the chat or the Q&A box. but probably safe and welcoming spaces is a good segue for us to move to Rebecca and hear about the amazing work that I know Rebecca and the team is doing at York Community Resource Centre, and your work in engaging with communities. So we'd love to hear what you're seeing on the ground, Rebecca.
Thank you, David. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Balladon land of which I'm on today, and I would also like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm Rebecca. I'm the Assistant Coordinator at the York Community Resource Centre in regional Western Australia. York is only an hour east from the CBD. It is an avid farming community with a very strong elderly population. We are privileged to be network partners with the Good Things Foundation and the BeConnected programme, as well as being Service Australia agencies. So with this, we offer a 24-hour free Wi-Fi within the surrounding of our centre that is specifically for Services Australia access, as well as having 9 till 4:30 Monday to Friday, our business hours, the Centrelink room, which I love how Kim put it down to people saying it's just a computer and a phone. Oh my goodness, that is what we hear so often. If myself or Robin are not here to assist because we are Services Australia agencies, that is exactly how they feel, but it is there. With that knowledge and with the Service WA app, we actually set up over 2,000 of those apps for our community's people, which I feel like now I could do with my eyes closed. At the time, I felt like it would have been easier to wrangle crocodiles. But it has given us a whole heap of experience and feedback. So we do thank you for the opportunity to speak today. We do have a unique opportunity to get a collection of real, honest and unfiltered feedback. And I mean, people are unfiltered. Being on that face-to-face level with the Services Australia customers, but not being a Centrelink office, it definitely seems to change the approachability and the feedback that we receive from our customers. They seem a lot happier to speak exactly how they feel, which we find really, really helpful, because that's kind of the honesty we need. We find, as probably everybody has over the years, when you ask somebody for feedback, it's almost like they kind of go, well, I'll give it nicely. When they'd like to discuss Centrelink or myGov or how anybody's feeling with us, they're not so polite. So one of the biggest feedbacks we received that we honestly just didn't consider, but we found an incredible insight, was the amount of people coming in with the new myGov app and the new myGov integration and believing that it was actually a scam. So we had just people coming in and they said, oh, I've got this thing saying that there's an app, it's a scam, I want to report it. And we were like, no, it's a thing. Let me show you how great this can be. And they were saying things like, no, last week I got a text message saying that myGov need to log in because I've got a rebate of $2,000 and that's a scam, this must be a scam. Absolutely threw us that was potentially a way that this was being seen by some people. They reported to us that there was a change of color and that there was a new app and they hadn't heard about it. So obviously it was a scam. So with that reluctancy for people to even look into it, and I think just unfortunately timed with that sort of Centrelink owes you money, send your bank details, we'll send you the refund, I think it just kind of threw some people. So it did take a bit of convincing. So I guess the sort of things that were being relayed to us were maybe a bit more marketing, maybe a bit more of an explanation of its coming out and what it was going to look like, and a kind of a preview in some sort of way. Another big question we are getting a lot, and secretly I would love to know too, is whether this is going to roll into the removal of the Medicare app and the Centrelink app. If you can access these things through the myGov, is it eventually going to be integrated that myGov app is the sole place to go, or do people still need to have all of these multiple apps on their phone? So the other thing that we had noticed is almost like a reluctance just to try something new. Learning a new app seemed to be like we were asking them to, you know, sheer sheep blind. It was a confusing thing for them, but with a bit of positivity, they definitely got on board. Now, we are always positive here at the CRC, positive outcomes always. So we would like to supply some of the more positive feedback. The ability to myGov access with a PIN entry via the app instead of the password and then the text is an absolute game changer. People love it. With the BeConnected program, I also facilitate a myGov exclusive. I only take about 6. We sit down, we get them onto myGov, and being able to say to them, now, let's do the app, and them just being mind blown that they now can get away with a PIN. People love it. They're sitting down and they're like, so I don't have to try to remember my password and then forget my password and try to remember my secret question. This is amazing. So brilliant. We love this. We also have found that people really seem to love the new color. We've had lots of people saying that they love the new blue and that they're finding the layout really easy to use. The option to have the notifications come onto your mobile that there's something there instead of waiting for the you've got mail email. Huge. People absolutely raving about it. So that's kind of the more on the ground information that we're getting. There's always reluctance, there's always concern. I had somebody who came to me and said, if everything's in my myGov, all anybody has to do now is steal my phone and they've got everything. And I said, well, no, they'd have to steal your phone, get your PIN of your phone, get your PIN of your myGov. It will be okay. So I think it's just continual reassurance from our level, putting out more marketing and more advertising that this app is a thing and that it is brilliant. We do find that people come in with whatever their reason, with an already almost negative outset of what getting myGov or help with their myGov is going to be. So we honestly find the more positive we can be and the more we can explain the steps and the process, the more they then come around to seeing it's actually a great system. We had a lady who came in and she just had to upload a document and she was just like, it's too difficult. They shouldn't expect me to do this. It cannot be done. And I was just like, okay, so you're going to show me how to do it and I'm just going to step you through it. And by the end of it, she was just like, it's not that hard, is it? I think I've got this now. And again, we use the app. So the fact that she could take a photo and upload from her mobile gallery already into that, she was very, very happy. So I'd just like to say again, thank you to everybody. And if anybody has any questions, I'm here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And please, keep talking in the chat and keep putting your questions in. But fantastic to hear your positivity, Rebecca, in terms of helping people along that journey, and for sharing some of the things that have been positive developments, not just some of the challenges of community members accessing myGov. So thank you. So we will now move to Q&A and encourage you to put questions into the chat or the Q&A box. I might start to Amit, just trying to pick up a few of the different questions through the chat, had been around the different channels that people are using to access myGov. So people are using different devices. There's there's the desktop access, there's the mobile. Amit responded, I think 60% of users are on mobile. We've also then heard about the app and we've heard about SMS, we've heard a range. So just to put that to Amit, just observations that came from the panel on that use of different channels and sort of what are the implications for us to think through there.
Sorry, I should have. I was hopefully being clear when I said we don't know the number of users that use mobile. We just know the number of visits that were mobile. You know, so 60% of the visits were were mobile. It's, you know, they'll give you a sense of the volume, but I think one of the challenges is actually that the mobile, you know, like the app is better, but the app could be even better, right? I mean, and one of the challenges I think that also came through in the chat is that, you know, the time between feedback and response on the, I mean, on the improvements of those things is probably, that development cycle is probably not as short as it should be. I mean, and the hope in moving it to being infrastructure is that people then build that as part of the kind of everyday nature of the work. I mean, at the moment, it's very difficult for government departments to think about that response between feedback and response, because they are not thinking about their investment cycle in that way. They've got a limited amount of money, and they're trying to allocate that to the amount of time that they can spend on that type of things, which is very different to the way in which you'd think about development cycles in the building of platform technologies that we are typically used to. I mean, when we are used to when we find a problem in, you know, when we find a problem on the Google app, we kind of know, you know, I mean, like, and someone complains about it, gets fixed usually in days. I mean, that's not the case here. On your question about the different channels, I think the key parts of those challenges. So I'd probably say there's kind of a few things that we thought about. One is, yes, people are using different channels, and those channels are ever growing and expanding. One of the things that was really important to us was not only just thinking about the fact that people were using different channels, it was also, this is the first dynamic, is that people use multiple channels for, you know, I mean, for doing a service. You know, I mean, so when you would typically use a phone, you know, I mean, for doing that service, that usually allocate, you know, you'd usually do everything on your phone, but actually what people were doing was they're using their phone and then finishing it off with a desktop. You know what I mean? And so how do we kind of deal with those particular sets of experiences, right? And how do we kind of improve those? I think one of the things that one of the other aspects of multi-channels was also working out the nature of how people respond between different services as they're using it. How do people kind of get access between different services? So I think that was sort of another aspect. The other one was also giving people the tools to be able to use those particular channels, right? You know what I mean? And I think Kim mentioned the State Library of Queensland sort of program. You know what I mean? We looked at that and we actually referenced it in the detail report. You know what I mean? And part of that is actually giving, you know, I mean, communities the tools to be able to use those particular services as they're coming up. And so, you know, one of the kind of challenges, I talked about fast cycling before, but one of the challenges of fast cycling is if you do it too quickly, there isn't enough time for people to kind of come along that journey and to build and learn from it. So you have to kind of balance those considerations. And I think the last part of the multi-channel, the last part of the different challenges is we're not dealing with the limited category of just how people experience it when they're online. You are representing government digital services, right? The end result is, have I improved the outcome for the citizen that was using it? So you have to take into account all of the circumstances that got the citizen in that particular place. You know, was there access to infrastructure that allowed them to do it? Or was there access to, you know, I mean, a network that allowed them to do it? You know, I mean, was there access to, you know, I mean, were they given access to the right sets of information that allowed them to do it? You know, I mean, like, what's the nature of the quality of the services, you know, I mean, that take account of their particular circumstances? What's the availability? What's the cost of the availability of data to be able to do it? You know, I mean, what's the nature of the service provided in that particular region or that area? You know, I mean, and so that, I think, is also part of a key part of how we were thinking about it. And what we were really keen to do is make sure that there were you know, what we're hoping, what the recommendation was, and what we hope over time becomes even truer, is that when a particular channel doesn't work, you can switch to another channel seamlessly and still get that kind of quality of service. You know what I mean? So there's fail safes to the fact that you aren't in the bucket of just mobile. You know, I mean, you can move to something else and actually get the response that you need.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, thank you so much. And I'm kind of aware we're about 6 minutes away from the end of our session, so keen to give Kim and Rebecca a chance to respond to a couple of the questions as well. Kim, I was wondering if you wanted to respond on some of the questions around the role of libraries, and in particular, kind of from your research, you know, what could be done to better support, you know, the roles of libraries and neighbourhood houses, community centres, and those organisations often act as that, that critical community conduit. But any suggestions, recommendations you have on that, or just more general observations on the role of libraries?
Oh, look, funding, David, funding, if we could get more funding for the libraries to do the work. I'm actually really looking forward to seeing how the government does respond to this, because I think they need to look, as Amit said it, at how myGov is used in different community contexts, and neighbourhood centres and libraries are really important. They're particularly important in Queensland. We're very decentralised. We don't often have a Centrelink often, and Rebecca, we talked about the phone and the computer, So actually having funding, and we've done it before with the My Health record. So to have some kind of funding for that would be fantastic. Again, I think a thing for our families that would be really helpful would be a 0 rating of the app. So if there could be some kind of 0 rating of, any government services online or on the app, that would be awesome. But, probably not realistic, but definitely, I think acknowledging that when you have so much service withdrawal in small towns, and it's not just government service withdrawal in small rural towns in Queensland, it's your retailers, your telcos. There's so many services that are going out of these towns. So we somehow have to find out how we then support, libraries and who's left there to support the most vulnerable members of their community.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kim. Well, and I know that issue of 0 rating certainly has been considered, and by a number of the states and territories as well. It was on the agenda for a recent Australian Digital and Data Ministers meeting, where that's exactly what they were asking. How could we enable some of that 0 rating of some of those services? And just Rebecca, would love to hear from you, particularly from the perspective, I guess, of what more could be done to support the role of community organisations like yourselves. I'm guessing funding is also an answer to that. So but that role of community organisations in doing this, how do we best support community organisations in this work? And I don't know whether you've got any comments on, in some of the sessions there it was coming up, it's obviously not just myGov. It's Service WA, it's Service New South Wales, it's all of the different levels of government as well as community services. So whether you've got any comments on that, but yeah, would love to hear from you if there's a magic bullet for how we better support community organisations in this work.
Well, look, to quote somebody directly, funding. I think in York particularly, we're quite lucky because obviously the library had the ability, when people come in, they do have the ability to redirect them to the Community Resource Centre, which is obviously where we are. But it's really hard to get community members to understand that we're contracted to a certain amount of hours per week. So while we have the facilities open from 9 till 4:30, our contract for actual one-on-one Services Australia is actually only from 9 till 11. So that's 2 hours a day. So it's not enough. I think the reality is, and I'm sure some people will agree with me, is it's probably never going to be enough to a certain extent, but the funding needs to be elevated so that we can at least be offering more. I think with the rollout, probably most predominantly, the factor that we had was people coming in, and it's time consuming. I think that there seems to be this belief that to download myGov and to put your details into it, that's quite a quick process, and it's not. And then to add the digital identity, and like you said, if you don't have the correct paperwork, well, a lot of our people will come in and they are within the town or only 10 minutes. We do have people who are out on farms that are a good 45 minutes drive in, 45 minutes drive out. They don't have the internet capabilities when they're out there to come in and find out, yeah, that they're missing one piece of paperwork. It's enough to make them, it's more than just despondency as well, because now they're despondent, they're frustrated, and they kind of go, well, then I just won't worry. But they know they have to. So then that makes them angry. So it's kind of these layered elements, and it's being able to give time, especially with our situation where we're 9 till 11, where you can sit with me and I can give you assistance. But if you've driven from your farm an hour away to sit down to realise that you're missing one piece of paper, you're not coming back today to get that sorted. And unfortunately, the funding is a thing. Look, in an ideal world, there would be that magic pot sat under a tree. So I do appreciate that while it's easy for us to say funding, I do know that it isn't always that easy to follow through, but it definitely needs to be a consideration, because you can see the frustration on the community's face that they can't get the assistance that they want straight away. And then that is an awful feeling from our point of view when all we want to do is help.
No, fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca. And that is amazing, amazing work you do to help members of the community. And some really good messages there about, yeah, that layering of support that's needed. And I think certainly that's been heard, the message of funding. But you made a good point, Rebecca. It's to what as well. So it's clear as to what that is. So I think we are at time. We could have continued for another hour on this discussion, but thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We'll put out in the next newsletter a recording of this content, as well as links to a whole lot of the pieces that were talked about today. There were some good comments made in the chat as well around accessibility, and we'll think about that for future meetings in terms of use of slides or no use of slides. So thank you for that feedback. But from my perspective, yeah, thank you so much again to Amit, Kim and Rebecca for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I think it was a really rich discussion. And thank you to Caitlin and our ADIA team, who does amazing work behind the scenes. And these sessions would not happen without all of those efforts that Caitlin puts in to make these available. So thank you so much, everybody. I think that's a wrap, and hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.